We're live.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Martin Willis, your host, and we have another great show for you this evening. I'm excited about it, and I want to welcome everyone. This week's guest is Shane Ryan. I would consider him like a lead investigator on or researcher into the 1966 Westall UFO Incident. It has several different names, the Westall Flying Saucer Incident, things like that. But anyway, it is another schoolyard sighting, a very, very interesting one with a cover-up and all kinds of very interesting things happen throughout that. A little bit of housekeeping first. First of all, I want to thank everyone that helps out with the show. Anyone can support the show. And we're also on Patreon as well, and that will get you a feed to the full 2-hour shows. There's a feed over there for that, as well as if anyone signs up at podcastufo.com, there's also the feed there and archives that goes way back. So as I said, a little housekeeping. I get a lot of email every week about Alejandro. Everyone's worried about Alejandro, which I think is nice. So I talked to him today. He's doing really well. He's just he's got so much going on. He's not up to date. I invited him on tonight as well, but he couldn't make tonight's show. He says he's just not up to date with what's going on in UFOs, hasn't been paying attention too much. But he said to his listeners of Open Minds, which I do help him out with, he had a nice interview, and recently he's going to be posting that soon. So keep your eye out for that for those of you who listen to the Open Minds show. T-shirts and stuff. We have a new site on our website, actually a merchandise store or whatever you want to call it. There's a link on podcastufo.com that has great T-shirts. There's 2 different types of graphics you can choose from. And one works really well with dark shirts, and one works with either or, light or dark. And as well as shirts, there's other products over there too, all with the Podcast UFO graphic on them. A very nice graphic, by the way, and Diane Cash made that beautiful job. So we also have a blog over at our website, podcastufo.com, and that is about, guess what, the Westall UFO. Charles Lear wrote an article, a blog about that incident, so you can read up on that if you want more information. That's on the website as well. The next 3 weeks are going to be tricky for me. Next week I have a big job in my career that I actually do, and I'm not going to be able to do a live show next week. So I'm going to try to figure that out. So if you're watching live on YouTube or just watch the shows on YouTube, just click the bell if you're a subscriber, or please do subscribe and click the little bell, and that will send you notifications of when my show will be coming up. But I'm going to be pre-recording. If you are a podcast listener, do not fret, because it'll be out Tuesday nights, same as always. And I'm not 100% sure if I'm going to be streaming these shows live on YouTube or not. I'll get that figured out. I had Chris O'Brien for next week, but he just informed me that he's on his way to the West Coast, so he's not able to be on the show. So I do not know who my guest is going to be next week. I'm working on that right now. And I think that I might be out of stuff to talk about, and that's plenty. And anyway, I'm going to now invite our guest. Welcome to the show, Shane.
Hello, Martin, all the way over there in Maine. It's lovely to see you again.
That's right. Yeah, we're doing the time travel here. You're actually in Wednesday, right? Wednesday morning.
That's right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And, it was this month, 6 years ago, that we last chatted on your show. I can't believe.
Was it that long?
Yeah, December 2013. six
Wow.
years ago. I
Yeah.
can't believe all that time has passed already.
I know. I know. And wasn't 2016 was the 50th anniversary, right? That was kind of a
That's right. Exactly. So when I started this research, I was actually a brunette and I didn't need spectacles. So you're now looking at what happens when you do 14 years of UFO research into one single UFO story. This is what it does to you.
yeah. Well, I had a full head of hair too.
You're
So
looking great.
yeah. But before we get into that, also I just wanted to talk quickly. You're not really that far. I've brought this up a few times with people in California, but you're not too far from the fires, right?
We're very close to where the fires are happening. So we've had an extremely early start to the bushfire season in Australia this year. It actually started in the middle of spring. Normally, we don't get really any serious bushfires until late December, early January, so well into summer. So I think what's happening is it's really analogous to what happened in California in their autumn, and when they were getting very bad bushfires unseasonally in terms of time, and the extremity of the fires that were happening in California were terrible, of course, and we're getting it here now in Australia, particularly in our eastern states, so New South Wales, parts of Queensland, parts of Victoria. I live in Canberra, which of course is in the Australian Capital Territory, which is surrounded by New South Wales, quite similar to the District of Columbia in America. But we're close to where the fires are as well, and many of our big cities like Brisbane and Sydney, Canberra, are being shrouded with bushfire smoke day in, day out.
I bet.
Here in Canberra, we're quite high. We're the highest city in Australia in terms of altitude. We sit at about 580 metres above sea level. So we tend to have very clear skies here. We don't have much in the way of heavy industry in Canberra. I guess a little bit similar to Washington or Ottawa. And so our air here is usually clear and pristine, but we're getting this bushfire smoke as it blows in from the bushfires nearby. And apparently the health people, the medical people, are telling us that it's equivalent to smoking 5 to 10 cigarettes per day when we breathe in this bushfire smoke. And particularly in places like Sydney, they've been doing this on a daily basis for a couple of weeks now. So it's terrible.
Wow. Wow. And not as far as the crow flies, probably in the hundreds of miles, not the thousands. You get the volcano, right, in New Zealand.
Yes.
I don't know exactly how far away that is from you, but still.
That's right.
Yeah.
That was terrible. And White Island in the Bay of Plenty in New Zealand. And unfortunately, most of the people who seem to have been caught up with that, both in terms of fatalities and injuries, are Australian tourists.
Oh.
And people from other countries as well, of course. But it's just shocking. Terrible.
Wow. Wow. A lot of stuff going on. Well, where you live is not really too far away from where this incident happened. Is that right? Are you fairly close by?
Well, it's certainly closer than Maine. So I'm in Canberra, and where this incident happened was in Melbourne, which is the state capital city of Victoria, Australia's second largest city. So about 8 hours drive, but yes, not very far in an aeroplane, and I imagine a little bit faster in a flying saucer.
I'm sure. And that's what we're going to talk about. So let's first of all, I think before I get into the incident itself, just I want to find out, did you have an interest in UFOs yourself prior to this case? Or is this what kind of led you into the study of UFOs or looking at them?
Well, as everyone says, that's a long and convoluted story, of course.
We have 2 hours.
I think, like a lot of kids, especially boys, I think often boys, perhaps more than girls, to generalize a little bit, I had a little bit of an interest in things like UFOs and space and mysterious things. And, I can actually trace it back quite specifically to when I was about 12 or 13 years old. And I was wandering through the department store in the city in which I grew up in, a place called Shepparton, about 2 hours north of Melbourne in Victoria. And it was a city of about 25,000 people, and we only had one department store. And the favourite part of that store for me was the book section. And back in those days, this was the late 1970s, we didn't have a lot of specialised bookstores back then in my town. So often, if you were interested in reading, you'd go to this book section in this department store. And I can remember one day wandering in, and on a stand was a series of books, world mysteries, and one of the titles was about ghosts, and one of the titles was about monsters, and one of the other titles was flying saucers, UFOs. And I picked it up, and it was lavishly illustrated, all these wonderful colour pictures, not photographs, but there were some photographs, but mainly pictures, illustrations, and there were some, what I now know to be quite well-known cases mentioned in the book, like the Kelly Hopkinsville case. I think the case that helped to give rise to the term Little Green Men, and the Thomas Mantell incident. Thomas Mantell, of course, you'll remember, was shot down chasing something over the skies of Kentucky, I think it was, back in the 1950s. Mm-hmm. So there were some of these classic so-called UFO cases, and I was fascinated. And so I bought the one about UFOs, I bought the one about ghosts, and I think I left the one about monsters on the shelf because I think that was just a little bit too frightening. And I took them home. And I think that's where it started. And also, of course, at that time on television, there were some classic UFO-related TV shows like Project Blue Book. Do you remember Project Blue Book? I think it was sometimes called Project UFO in America.
Yeah, Project UFO, right. Mm-hmm.
That's right. So when it was televised in Australia, it was called Project Blue Book. And I watched that, as a lot of people did. And then, of course, there was the wonderful program In Search Of, hosted by the late Leonard Nimoy.
Yeah.
And it was all fascinating to me. And I think part of the reason it was fascinating for me was my father had passed away when I was 1 year old. Mm-hmm. And so I was very much aware of his absence when I was growing up. Wow. And my mother, raising me on her own. And I was very conscious of there being this mysterious aspect to life, that there was something potentially beyond what was immediately obvious to us, that there perhaps was really an unseen world as well as a seen world. And as a child, I think I was rather impressionable and impressed by that. But because I'd had a father, but my father had passed away and he was now gone from me, I felt, well, there must be this other world where things aren't immediately visible. And I think that played into where this perhaps all began. But of course, that was when I was a child. And as I grew up and graduated from secondary school and went to university and started work, those things got left behind, as they do, because you get involved in work and all the demands of being an adult. And so I really sort of pushed all those things aside and didn't really think about the UFO subject again until I moved from my hometown Shepparton and went down to Melbourne to start my university study. And I went to a university called Monash University, which, as it turned out, is only about 5-10 kilometres, maybe, not even that, up the road from Westall. But I had no idea about Westall at the time. But what did happen was I was doing a bit of university. I started that. I was actually doing a degree in Japanese studies because in the intervening years, I'd been sent to Japan as an exchange student by the International Rotary Organization, and had come back from living in Japan for a year, very interested in Japanese culture, Japanese language, Japanese politics. and started a degree at Monash University in Japanese. But very, what's the word? I guess it's sort of happenstance. I found a place to live near the university with a lady who was just beginning to retire from her long career at that time as an infant welfare nurse in Melbourne. And she had been for a few years hosting university students at her home as boarders, both Australian students and students from other countries. And I was in search of a place to stay. And so I ended up becoming a boarder at her house. And we became good friends over the years that I lived with her. And she happened to mention to me one day that she had a couple of friends who knew about a flying saucer incident, which had happened up the road from where we were living, again, only about 15 kilometres away, at a place called Westall, which I'd never even heard of. And she told me the bare bones of the story. She didn't know a great deal about it, but simply that this school, Westall High School, and the school next door, the Westall State Primary School, had been involved in this mass sighting of a flying saucer, and that hundreds of people had seen it, kids had seen it, some of the teachers were involved, some of the local residents were involved, and she knew this from these friends of hers, and so she told me the story. And I remember doing this, we actually did a drive in her car. We went over to Westall and we drove around the perimeter of the school, and we didn't know what we were doing or what we were looking at. Of course, we were just going for a drive. And then we drove back home to her house where I was living and pretty much forgot about it, except for the fact that at some point afterwards, I came across a book by an Australian author, a fellow called John Pinckney, who had a long career as a newspaper reporter and an author in Australia. And John also had a strong interest in UFOs and the paranormal and things that were a little bit unusual, mystery stories, unsolved murders, people who had disappeared. And he penned several books over the years on that topic. And I happened to pick up one of those books. This is the one actually, called A Paranormal File by John Pinckney. And I opened it up and lo and behold, there were a couple of sections in the book about Westall, like this one, The Saucer That Shocked a School. And just a few pages, 2.5 pages. And then there was another small section, Students Punished for Discussing the Westall UFO. And so I read these sections in his book, and of course it confirmed some of the details that my friend had heard from her friends. And that was the end of it for me, because I was working, I'd done some university, and then I went back over to Japan to live and did some more university study there, and completely forgot about the Westall story. Just didn't think of it at all until years later, many years later. In fact, it was 2005, when my friend who had told me this story had actually, by that stage, passed away. And I was looking around for a story to write a book about. I was having an early midlife crisis, I think, and I wanted to pen a book about something.
I've had several, by the way, yeah.
That's right. And I was particularly interested in writing a book that would be read by children and young adults, teenagers. And I don't know how it came into my mind. It popped into my mind, and I don't know from where or how. I remembered this story about a UFO incident that had happened at a couple of schools and had been witnessed by all of these people, young people and some adults. And I thought to myself, well, a lot of what I've heard, not that I had heard very much about it, is probably not true. It's probably partly an urban legend, and there must have been accretions to the story and things that had been perhaps made up, not maliciously, but just as these things happen over time. So I thought, well, I'll do a little bit of research, and I set up a Yahoo Groups website. This is way back before social media, before Facebook, when Yahoo Groups was one of the main ways that you could make contact with people over the internet.
Yeah. Wow.
And in my innocence and naivety, I set up this Yahoo Groups website, put it out into cyberspace, and to see what would happen. And some people noticed it. And I got some people contacting me about the story. And I actually had a couple of articles printed in a couple of the local newspapers around Westall. And that led to quite a response from people who did actually, as I was hoping they would, remembered the story and had actually been involved in the story. And one witness led to 3, and then 3 led to 6, and 6 led to 12, and it went on like that. And then the science editor of the main broadsheet newspaper in Melbourne, a newspaper called The Age, saw the story. And he, for some reason, was quite interested in it. And he contacted me. And that led to an almost full-page article back in 2005 about the Westall story. And from there, it just sort of bloomed and blossomed. And more people contacted me. And that eventually led to a filmmaker in Melbourne by the name of Rosie Jones, a very accomplished filmmaker, seeing that story because she's a reader of the Age newspaper, and she happened to come across the article. She contacted me. She flew up to Canberra from Melbourne. We sat down. I remember we had our meeting in the National Film and Sound Archive building in Canberra. It was a lovely building and a lovely setting, very appropriate for Rosie as a filmmaker. And I simply told her the story as I understood it and what my interest was. And she went back to Melbourne, thought about it for a couple of weeks, contacted me and said, Shane, it's an interesting story and I'm interested in it from a couple of angles. Would you be interested in participating in a documentary film about it and about your research in it? And again, in my innocence, in my naivety, and perhaps lack of modesty, I said, sure, that sounds like a wonderful idea. And that's what led to the 2010 film being broadcast on the Australian Sci Fi Channel, Westall 66, the Suburban UFO Mystery.
I believe that's up on YouTube, if I'm not mistaken. Now, I believe it is, because I think I watched that a while back. We only have about 2 minutes before we're going into the break, so we just have to keep that in mind. But I did want to start talking about the story itself. What was it, April 6th or something like that? 1966.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
But again, we only have about a minute. So I think what I'm going to do is hopefully I'll just go right into the break now, and we'll talk about the incident itself when we come back. So hang in, everyone. We'll be right back right after these messages.
And we're clear, Martin.
All right. How much time do we have?
Just under 4 minutes.
All right. Very good. All right. So, Shane, we are still live, as I mentioned to you prior.
Sure.
We're still live on YouTube currently. And so at this time, I usually talk about a different topic. And so I am wondering if you can talk about the UFO groups that are in. I know there's the Victoria group. I actually interviewed some representatives from that, had a great time with them. And Phoenix last year, they were there, and not last year, a few months ago in September. Mm-hmm. Had a really wonderful time with that group there. And but are there a lot of other active groups on UFOs?
There are some. I think the era of the UFO groups is not as strong as it once was. So I think obviously going back to the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and in the early part of the 1980s, there were a lot of UFO groups based in the various states of Australia. And often they would meet in the state capital cities, which in Australia, unlike the American tradition, all of our state and territory capital cities are the largest cities. And so that's where most people live. And so the meetings were generally held there.
I see.
And of course, they were very much into UFO research, but they were social groups.
Mm-hmm.
They were support groups, and they were bringing in a little bit like a service club or a church or some other social organization. They were very much about coming together, talking about the latest sightings, discussing research, but having a cup of tea and a scone and a cake and maybe doing the occasional excursion and going on a field trip. And with the passage of time and the advent of social media and the internet, and that's all broken down a little bit, which in a way is a little bad.
Mm-hmm.
But the groups still exist. They've morphed a little bit over the years into different formats. But of course, the group you mentioned, the Victorian UFO Action Group in Victoria, based in Melbourne, it's in a way replaced an earlier organisation which had existed previously to that. There's another group in New South Wales and in Queensland, perhaps smaller groups in Tasmania and South Australia and Western Australia. But a lot of the way people communicate these days is, of course, like this, like we're doing over YouTube and the internet and Facebook. But I think those groups still have an important role to play. And I've certainly appreciated the support the Victorian UFO Action Group have shown me in recent years. They've very much taken on the Westall story as one of their celebrated stories.
Yeah.
And some of the members of the group are researching it as well, and they've always been very supportive of me and have organised a couple of events over recent years to talk about it.
Right. I think when I was meeting first with Ben Hurl and a few other people in Phoenix, someone messaged you right away, because I had your old email address. I had been trying to reach you, and you were not getting the emails, and so that's what actually made this connection, and here we are. Looks
Martin,
like
we're ready to go.
Okay, we're ready to go here too.
All right, stand by.
Yep.
Programs, all free and available to download in Google Play or the iTunes App Store. This is Podcast UFO.
Okay, here we go, Martin. In 5, 4, 3, 2.
All right, everyone, welcome back. My guest this evening is Shane Ryan from Australia. We're talking about the Westall UFO Incident, or Westall UFO. Has many names, like I mentioned. And let's talk about the incident, exactly what happened. It's quite amazing, actually, when the amount of witnesses and all that. So if you would, go over exactly what happened on April 6, 1966.
Sure, Martin. Thank you for that. It's an important incident because it did happen, as you mentioned, on the 6th of April in 1966. And unlike, I guess, most UFO incidents, this was unusual in that it happened in broad daylight. It was about 10:15 in the morning when it first happened. And it happened in front of literally hundreds of people. So initially, it was in front of the two classes of kids who were doing physical education classes on the sports ground at Westall High School. And Westall, by the way, it's about 21 kilometres southeast of the central business district, the centre of Melbourne. So at that time in 1966, a suburban area, but on the fringe. So it was partially suburban and rapidly becoming more so, but it was also partially still country, semi-agricultural. So mixed in around the houses and some of the factories and shops that were being built were still market garden areas, farms. And so it was a mixture of both city and country. But it was an incident that happened in front of a large number of people. Initially, those two groups doing PE on the sports ground. But then when the recess bell went, that then involved literally almost the entire population of the school coming out onto the sports ground and witnessing what the other kids had been seeing 5 or 10 minutes previously. And before the recess bell went, one of the students who was doing physical education on the sports ground came rushing in to the classroom that was being a class being taught by Andrew Greenwood, who was one of the science teachers at the school. He was a young teacher. It was his first year of teaching. He was only about 21 years old himself. And a girl rushed in from the class saying, Mr. Greenwood, there are flying saucers outside. And, of course, the classroom erupted into pandemonium. But Andrew brought the class back under control. He told the student to not be silly and to go back out to the sports ground and to close the door, which she did. And he brought the class back under control. But it was literally only about 5 minutes later that the recess bell went. And Andrew Greenwood's interest was actually piqued, as you would imagine. And so he actually went out to the sports ground and the class followed him. And lo and behold, he actually did see what all the other kids had been watching for the previous 5 or 10 minutes. And he saw Andrew Greenwood saw one flying saucer-shaped object up in the sky. Now, as I'm talking about this incident, it's always a little bit difficult because it's hard for me to know whether to use the singular or the plural, because even though most of the witnesses, and so far I've actually been in contact with 117 people who saw the flying saucer or flying saucers, there is a smaller group, a subset of that 19 people that I've been in contact with, so 19 out of the 117 who are adamant there were more than one, and they remember them being 2 or 3. So it does seem to me that there was more than one, but it's true to say that most of the witnesses remember seeing one, and Andrew Greenwood is certainly one of those people. But as he went out, most of the rest of the school joined him on the sports ground, and there were kids literally hanging off the perimeter fences of the school on the western side and the southern side, looking up at the sky, trying to get a closer look at this object. And the object that most people remember seeing was in that classic flying saucer shape that we're so used to people talking about, particularly from that era, from the 1950s and the 1960s. Mm-hmm. And so they describe it as being like a bowl on top of another bowl, or a bowl on top of a plate. Some people even describe it as a teacup on top of a plate, which I guess is a very British or Australian way of describing a flying saucer. Mm-hmm. They don't mean there was a handle on the cup, but it was like a cup or bowl shape on top of another bowl or plate shape. And that it was metallic looking, that it was silver or grey in colour, that it didn't seem to be making any sound, or if it did, it was a very, very low humming sound. There didn't seem to be any obvious windows or portholes, no obvious rivets or seams or joins, and that it was flying without any of the attributes you would normally associate with a flying object. So no tail, no fins, no wings, no strings or ropes, no propellers, no engines. So something very mysterious. And you have to remember that there was a very busy airport called Moorabbin Airport, only 5 kilometres away from the schools. Mm. And at that time, Moorabbin Airport was Melbourne's second airport. And it was actually by flight number of flights, about the busiest airport in the Southern Hemisphere at that time. Wow. And there was almost no possible time you could be at Westall, at the schools or elsewhere, and not hear, or see, aircraft flying above, doing the circuits and bumps training exercises that planes often do. And the kids were very, very used to seeing those planes. And those planes were mostly training aircraft. So aircraft like Cessnas or Piper Chieftains, maybe Chipmunks. So that sort of light aircraft. Hmm. But what they saw this day was nothing like that. Nothing like that at all. And the kids observed the object, or objects, flying around, going from one side of the sky to the other, moving so quickly, it was as if the witnesses, couldn't quite tell, was it blinking off, vanishing, and then blinking on and reappearing at the other end of their sky, the vista that they could see? Or was it just simply flying so quickly from one side to the other that it looked like it was doing that? It ascended, descended, again, no sound. It would make these strange angular turns that nobody had ever associated with aircraft. And then at some point, 5 actual aircraft flew in. And most of the witnesses who remember seeing these aeroplanes remember them simply as being ordinary light aircraft, like Cessnas. They may not have been Cessnas, but they were something like that.
Yeah.
Aircraft that they were well used to seeing. And these planes were trying to chase these flying objects. And the planes would get close to one of the objects, and then the UFO would move away effortlessly and go to another part of the sky. The plane would do the long banking turn that planes need to do, making the sound of the engines that planes need to do, and try to get closer to one of the objects again, and then the object or objects would move off again. And so this, what was described in the newspaper reports at the time as like a cat and mouse exercise, went on for several minutes. And then at some point after this, at least one of the objects went down to an area called the Grange, which was an old rural property, which had an old house on it, but it had a large area of land. And on part of that land was a large grove of pine trees. And the kids at the school just called that area the Pines. They knew it well because they often went over there for their cross-country running or their excursions when they went looking for frogs. And the local kids used it as their local playground. And this object flew down to that grove of pine trees and was seen to disappear behind the trees. And it sat behind those trees for something like perhaps 10 minutes, may have been 15 minutes. It's hard to tell the exact time, but it was something of that nature. Enough time, in fact, to give a certain cohort of the kids time to jump over the boundary fence, over a ditch, a channel that was between the fence and the unmade street road at the back of the school, over that road, through the market gardens, down a dirt track, down towards the Grange, chasing this quarry, chasing this object which they had been watching in the sky, high, low, left, right, fast, slow, and it came down, and they wanted to find it. And it was an extraordinary thing in a way, because we're talking about school children in the 1960s, aged between about 12 and 15, who knew about the worst thing you could possibly do at school was to leave the school's grounds.
Oh, sure.
Without permission of a teacher or your parents, without a note, because it was dangerous, because you were crossing a road, because you were going into the bush, because you didn't have permission. But there was a group of them, and so I guess they felt like they had a little bit of support and a little bit of courage, and off they went. And a certain group, a small group, according to some of the witnesses, got there in time down to the Grange to see one object, either sitting on the ground or just perhaps a little bit above the ground. And one of the witnesses talking about getting down there and seeing 4 kids, a couple of boys, a couple of girls, and the boys were a little bit further back from the object. The girls were a little bit closer, and the girls had been affected somehow by the object. One had fainted and was still on the ground. One was sort of dusting herself off and still getting up. And this witness then watched the object lift up from where it had been. It went up into the sky a few meters, turned into a vertical plane, and then shot off fast up into the sky, joining 1 or 2 others that were still up there. And then at great speed, the 3 objects flew away. Again, in that vertical plane, flying off so quickly that hardly anybody could notice where they had gone to. So this was not your normal start to the school day at Westall High School.
Right. Before we move on, let me just ask a couple of things. So you just mentioned that they just flew off with the 3 objects, but there's still confusion between some of the witnesses whether there was one object or multiple objects, even though this thing flew off together with those other 3?
Well, Martin, it wouldn't be a flying saucer story if there wasn't confusion.
No, you're right. You're right.
If you have clarity, then it can't be a UFO story. It can't be a bona fide flying saucer incident. So,
That's true. That's true.
And I think we know that from some of the other, perhaps better known historical incidents from over the years, which we're all still talking about after all of these years and trying to nut out the finer details. But it's true. In a sense, there's some confusion. It's not really confusion, I guess, from the perspective of someone trying to understand it, like me as a researcher, it can be a bit confusing. But in the minds of the witnesses, there's not much confusion, because you were either a witness who remembered seeing one and one only, or you were a witness and it's a smaller number that I've been in contact with. And of course, there's lots of people who were witnesses potentially that I've not yet been in contact with who saw 2 or 3. And so those people are either adamant there were 3, for example, or they're adamant there was only 1. And mostly those people are happy to admit that they saw what they saw, but what they saw, of course, was conditioned by where they were standing, when they got to where they were standing, what else was happening around them, and of course their memory and the frailty of their memory. And so most people are adamant about what they saw, but they're happy to admit that there may have been other people who saw something slightly different.
I see.
The interesting element to that aspect of the story is that there were 165 people I've been in contact with who remember seeing the circles left behind in the paddock, in the grassy field, by whatever these objects were. And so a larger number then saw the actual flying saucers, which makes sense because there was more time for people to go down after school, local residents, and see these trace marks, what in fact had been left behind apparently by these objects. And of that group of 165, there are 25 who remember seeing more than one circle. So as a proportion, it's almost the same percentage of people who remember seeing more than one flying saucer as opposed to one flying saucer. So there's certainly evidence that there are certainly a group of witnesses who remember seeing more than one trace mark, more than one circle, which would seem to indicate that perhaps there was indeed more than one object involved. It's hard to be definitive, of course. Yeah. My job as the researcher is to strive to be definitive, but obviously I've got to hold all of these parts of the jigsaw puzzle together somehow and to find as many of the common denominators as I can. Sure. And for those common elements to tell the thrust of the story.
Right. So another thing you mentioned early on was that there was no apparent rivets, portholes, seams, anything like that. So that seems to indicate that it was seen rather closely. Would you be able to tell us what is the guess of the closest that someone was able to view the object?
Sure. Obviously, measurements are a tricky thing, and particularly after the passage of all this time. But there are several witnesses who remember being very close to the object. There's one witness who features in the documentary Westall 66, who was the one sole person that we know of that I've been in contact with. He says there were a couple of other boys who did what he did, which was jump the western boundary fence, where there was a mass of kids and at least one teacher viewing the object. He says there were 2 objects at that point, landed or almost landed in the paddock next to the school. He remembers there being a bit of a space between the bottom of these 2 flying saucers and the grass. And he got so close. This witness's name is Victor, by the way. Victor got so close to one of the objects that he could feel heat coming off it.
Wow.
And put his hand up towards it to touch it, but thought not to do that, had second thoughts about doing that because he could feel the heat coming off. And so he backed away. And so he took his hand back. Probably a smart move. Yeah. That's right. If he was to do it now, he said to me the other day that he'd probably put his hand on and hang on for dear life. and probably knock on the outside. But he didn't do that. He was at that point, 13 years old, I think. And so he took his hand back. And then he took a few steps back and walked back towards the fence. And as he did, one of the objects lifted up and flew down towards the Grange. The other object, he said, flew up and didn't go down to the Grange, but went up into the sky and went high in the sky and stayed there. So he was very close. Another witness, a lady by the name of Terry, she was the witness, one of the students who had gone down to the Grange and saw the 4 kids in front of her, between her and the flying saucer, and saw the 2 girls affected by the flying saucer fainted on the ground. And she estimates that she was probably within about 5 meters, maybe 10 meters off the flying saucer. Again, close enough to be able to get a good view of it, so much so that when it lifted up and before it turned into the perpendicular, the vertical axis, she could see what appeared to be bluish, purplish coloured lights on the bottom, rotating in a fashion, pulsating as it lifted up. There were other witnesses who were on the sports ground at the time before the flying saucer went down to the Grange, who they felt they were so close to the object, they felt as though it was coming down in front of them, and they were so petrified, thinking that the object was actually going to crash or going to land on the sports ground in front of them. And there were a set of goal posts, Australian rules football goal posts on the sports ground. So you can imagine some goal posts, and a couple of the witnesses referred to the flying saucer being almost at the top of those goal posts. So we're only talking there about, what would that be? Maybe 10 meters or so above the ground where they were standing. And some of the kids watching this happen were afraid. They were petrified. One of the girls talks about wetting her pants, being so scared, being so taken aback about what was happening in front of her, wetting her pants, rushing off to the toilets, taking refuge, taking cover from what she thought was about to happen on the sports ground. And so some of these witnesses were pretty close.
So is this like a group trauma? I mean, was everyone, or were some people fascinated and some were, traumatized? And I want to talk about Tanya, I believe it is too. But is that what was happening? Was it a mixture, or was it everyone was scared?
No, I don't think everybody was scared at all. It certainly was a mixture. So it was very dependent upon, I think, where people were, when they were there, and of course, most importantly, I imagine, how they were as people, their personalities, their demeanours. And so a lot of the witnesses, most of the witnesses talked to me about finding it extremely exciting. It was exciting. It was something that they remember very, very fondly. They remember it as being the most incredible thing that's happened to them in their lives. As a memory, it's the strongest memory that they ever have, probably up there with having children. But there are certainly some witnesses who have talked to me about it being traumatic, that it was scary, it was frightening, it was worrying for them. And I guess one wonders how many of that particular cohort, that subset of witnesses perhaps, have decided not to talk to me or to come forward or to talk to other people, because for them it was that sort of experience for whatever reason. And it's perhaps the students, the children, and perhaps the older adults for whom it was more of an exciting incident, who have decided to talk more about it and to be more open about it.
And what's a scoop with what happened with Tanya?
So there is a student who was at the school by the name of Tanya, and there are several witnesses who remember her as being somehow connected with the flying saucer incident. So some of the people remember that she was the girl who ran into the science classroom being taught by Andrew Greenwood and sliding the door back and shouting out, "There are flying saucers in the sky, flying saucers in the sky." And some people are very clear that it was her. Other people are not so clear and just remember it being a female student or a student. But for those who remember it being a specific student, they do usually name it as this girl, Tanya. And one of the other witnesses remembers very clearly Tanya being one of the students who raced down towards the Grange in chase of the flying saucer. And this witness, a lady called Jacqueline, raced after her and also tried to race down to the Grange. But Tanya apparently was a very fast runner, faster than Jacqueline. And about halfway down towards the Grange, Jacqueline noticed Tanya coming back in the opposite direction, back towards the school property, screaming, hysterical. And Jacqueline tried to grab her and hold her and ask her what was going on, but she was too upset. She was too hysterical. She was frightened by something, and she broke her grip and raced back towards the school. So Jacqueline at that point decided not to go any further and to turn around and to go back towards the school. And when they got back to school, Jacqueline remembers, she's not absolutely sure about the passage of time, but she remembers not very long afterwards an ambulance being at the school, Tanya being attended to by the ambulance officers, and Tanya being taken away in the ambulance. And there are a couple of other witnesses who have that same visual memory, and there are some other witnesses who heard that that was the case.
Wow.
And one of the witnesses, Terry, who I mentioned before, thinks it was Tanya who was down at the Grange, fainted on the ground, having been affected by what she had seen close range to the flying saucer. So that's Tanya's story. And the other aspect of Tanya's story is that two of the witnesses, Jacqueline and Terry, who were both friends with Tanya, separately went around to Tanya's house. They knew where she lived. They'd been to her house before. Her house wasn't very far from the school. And knocked on Tanya's door to see how she was. And Tanya wasn't there. Her family wasn't there. And in fact, a stranger that neither of these girls had ever met before answered the door and told them that Tanya wasn't there, had never lived there. There was no one there by that name. But both kids had been to that house before.
Wow, I never heard that part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, so they knew that that was Tanya's house. They knew that Tanya's family lived there. And yet there was this strange lady at the door saying, sorry, no one here by that name. And neither Jacqueline or Terry ever saw Tanya again. She didn't return to the school. And it wasn't until years later, apparently, that some of the other kids, as young adults, met up with her later. But she was not seen at the school again. Now, Tanya's been hard to find. It's possible that a lady with her name has been found, Rosie Jones. The filmmaker for Westall 66 believes she has been in contact with her, but Tanya doesn't really want to talk about the story. She confirms that she was there at Westall High School, that she remembers the flying saucer incident, but not other aspects of the story. And Rosie, as a professional filmmaker, of course, has agreed to protect this lady's privacy and to honour her request not to be involved anymore or to be interviewed. And so that's where that aspect of the story currently sits.
Wow, isn't that amazing? So I was not also aware that they found her as well. All right, well, we're at our real break at the 55, so we're going to go into the break. So hang in, everyone. We'll be right back right after these messages. All right, welcome back. This is Martin Willis, and my guest is Shane Ryan. We're talking about the Westall UFO, and a very interesting case. And we're also going to be talking a little bit later on about other UFO cases in Australia. There's a lot going on there, has been. And actually, I've talked about this before, but Australia is my third largest listening base. And that's really saying something of a country with 26 million compared to other, major countries. So a lot of listeners in Australia. And I have to figure out a way to get there. I've always wanted to go to Australia, so one of these days I'm going to have to figure out a reason to be there.
I suggest Qantas, Martin. Qantas.
Okay. So we were talking about Tanya. I don't know her last name. I don't know if I've seen her last name anywhere. But did she ever give a reason for why she vanished and never came back to school and that whole thing? Did she ever give any part of that detail?
So unfortunately, there's nothing publicly available in relation to the rest of Tanya's story. And as I mentioned, Rosie Jones has agreed to honour her desire for privacy. And so we simply don't know really much more about her story. It would be nice to know some more. For me, obviously it's an interesting element to the story and people do latch onto it, and that's understandable. But from a researcher's perspective, because it's been very difficult to confirm many of those elements that other people have talked about in relation to her, it's hard for me to take it any further. And I guess for me as well as the research, because I have so many other witness accounts on my books, there's lots of other things for me to delve into and to talk about. And there are some things I haven't yet mentioned, of course. And so it's an interesting element to the story, no doubt about it, but I have to put it into the context of all the other elements. And particularly if it's difficult for me to drive that research avenue any further, then there's not really much I can do. It's, as any UFO researcher will know, you can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And we have to accept the frustrations and the limitations. We can only research what we can research. We can only go on the amount of information that people are prepared to give us, and do the best we can with what we are given.
Right. Now, the aftermath of this case is almost just as interesting as the case itself. So why don't we go into that aspect of it?
That's true. So the aftermath is as interesting as the actual incident itself, because, and I always talk about this as a flying saucer incident. And I talk about that because it's nostalgic, because that's the terminology, the vocabulary of the 1960s. And some people, of course, don't like using that terminology because it's loaded and carries baggage, and all of that is true. But I stick with it because I love the nostalgia of it, and because that was the terminology that was used by a lot of the witnesses at the time. When they saw this object, these objects, that's how they described them. Of course, it doesn't tell us very much about where they were from, why they were there, how they were being flown, who was inside, what was inside, if anybody, if anything. And all of that remains mysterious. And of course, that's something we all want to know. I mean, that's the nub of the mystery, of course. And I want to know all of those things as much as anybody. But another aspect to my research, and I guess it was the aspect I thought I would be able to be more successful with, because the other stuff is a little bit harder to solve, is to work out who responded to this incident. Why did they respond to it? Why did they respond to it in the way that they did? Why was there a secrecy, a veil of secrecy, it seems, lowered over this whole story? And why were so many people given the message, either overtly or covertly, that this was a story, a happening that wasn't to be admitted to, that wasn't to be talked about? And of course, it's from talking to so many of the witnesses over the years that I've been able to put the pieces together that there was such a large response. The police responded. The Royal Australian Air Force responded. It seems that elements of the Australian Army were involved. The Civil Defence Organisation responded. 2 separate fire brigades from separate fire departments were involved. The ambulance service was involved, at least for one student. And there were possibly other elements of the Australian and Victorian state governments that were involved as well, and at a seemingly very high level. All for something that was written off at the time as being probably a meteorological balloon that had been blown a little bit off course and had been sighted by some excitable children at a couple of schools in the fringes of Melbourne. But it wasn't about that at all. It was something else. And so it was that response and the cover-up and me trying to work out what those people who responded to this incident found, what they discovered, what they wrote up into their reports, what went into the archives. What was all that about? And why couldn't it have been divulged at the time? Why couldn't it have been shared with the media? Why couldn't it have been shared with the people who were involved, who were there on the ground? And why, after all of these years, more than 50 years has passed, 54 years, is there still not a skerrick of paperwork in any of the publicly accessible archives, government archives, about this story? And I, over the years, as you would imagine, filed quite a few Freedom of Information applications, requests for information. I've got some of the paperwork here to the National Archives of Australia, to the Australian Department of Defence, to the Victoria Police, to the Victorian Department of Education, the department responsible for running the schools. And all of those responses from these people and from others have come back saying either we've looked, we've searched through all our available records and there's nothing there, or because it's so old, we don't have to, or because it's so old, any archival material that we may have collected has, under the requirements of federal legislation, gone to the National Archives of Australia. And the National Archives of Australia have already told me they have nothing.
Wow.
So there's this problem. We know something happened. We know there were people on the ground there in uniform and in civilian clothes. And yet not a single piece of documentation apparently exists to explain that. And so that's the other aspect. That's what's so mysterious about this. Because even with cases, better known cases perhaps, that people have been looking at over the years, like Roswell or Rendlesham, there's documentation, there's information. But for Westall, I guess a little bit like, in a way, another incident which happened at around the same time in Pennsylvania, the Kecksburg incident. You'll remember that.
Yep.
Something obviously happened. The police were there, the fire department was there, the army turned up, there was some media there, and yet there's nothing to be found in the government archives about that story either. So it's a little bit akin to that sort of incident. And when you actually make contact with some of the people who were there in uniform, their responses are very, very interesting. And there haven't been many that I've made contact with. There have been a couple of firemen who remember it clearly, who remember responding. And they're as baffled by anybody as to what it was and what they saw that day. But it certainly happened. They were there. But there's one surviving police officer who was there that day. It took him many years to admit it. He always denied it. But about 2 or 3 years ago, a journalist who I had arranged to contact him, he still lives in the house, by the way, that he lived in back in 1966. He's
Wow.
still there. He's a man now, I believe, in his 80s. He's not very well. But he finally admitted in a telephone call with this journalist that he'd been there that day. Yes, he was part of the Victoria Police response, but he wasn't prepared to talk about it. And one of the high school witnesses is actually a family friend of this man. This witness, her parents, were a friend with this police officer. And when this witness's father passed away, this former police officer was at her dad's funeral. And she had been trying for years to talk to this man, Jack, about what he had seen that day and why the police were there. What were they doing? What did they see? And she went up to Jack at the end of the funeral and she said to Jack, "Jack, would you please just tell me what happened at Westall that day? What was it that we all saw?" And he said to her, her name is Sue, he said, "Sue, and if I tell you, what will you do with the information?" And Sue said, "Jack, it's just for me. I need to know. It's for my own sanity. I need to know. I know you know something. Please tell me. I won't tell anybody. And Jack looked at her and said, Sue, I don't believe you.
Wow.
And he wouldn't spill the beans. And this was at this poor lady's dad's funeral, father's funeral, as I said, her dad's
Amazing.
funeral.
Wow.
So a very emotional time for her, but she felt it was a time to bring it up with him. And I tried talking to him on the telephone. And so whatever it was, whatever was said to him as a young police officer, probably who was on the periphery of the event in a way, he still feels the need to keep silent.
That's amazing. And what about the silencing of the media? Did that happen as well?
It looks as though it did happen because Melbourne had several daily newspapers at that time. And one was a broadsheet newspaper, The Age, which I mentioned earlier. And it carried a very small article the next day documenting that there'd been a flying saucer sighting at a school in Westall and that it may have been explained by a meteorological balloon flying over. And that was the extent of the article, seen by hundreds of students and teachers, but it was probably, perhaps, a meteorological balloon. There were three, not broadsheet newspapers, but what's the opposite of broadsheet? You know what I mean? Less serious newspapers, not broadsheet newspapers, newspapers that perhaps had a bigger following in terms of readership. And a couple of those newspapers in particular were known for carrying stories about UFO incidents, about flying saucers. And of course, there were such stories in those years, in the 1960s. None of those newspapers carried a single sentence about this incident. So it seems as though somebody perhaps made a phone call to the editors of these newspapers and said, for national security, this is a story not to be reported. Or if it is to be reported in the way The Age did, in that very truncated way and with an explanation, a possible explanation given for what it was that everybody saw. And a few days after the incident, one of those newspapers carried a cartoon lampooning UFOs and people seeing UFOs. But fascinatingly, on the very day after the Westall incident, and this is perhaps, it might be just a coincidence or an example of Australian humour, I don't know, but was actually, in the afternoon newspaper that day, the 6th of April, so the same day as the incident happened, in one of those newspapers called the Herald, there was this wonderful article, an advertisement really, about how the defence of Australia is in very good hands. The Royal Australian Air Force, Australia's aerial defence, is in their hands. And it's an ad about the various ways in which the Royal Australian Air Force is keeping Australia's air safe and defended from threats. And there's radar and there's the jets and there's the surface-to-air missiles. And this happens on the very same day as Westall Incident. So a wonderful coincidence, perhaps.
Yeah, that is interesting. Now, wasn't there I remember when we talked before, wasn't there a teacher that took a bunch of photographs of the flying saucer, or one of them? And what was the deal with that?
So there are several witnesses who recall that one teacher took photographs. And some of the kids remember that it was the female science teacher, Ms. Robbins. Others remember that it was the male science teacher, Mr. Greenwood. And I've been in contact with Andrew Greenwood over the years and have had a face-to-face meeting with him. And he says it definitely wasn't him. He didn't take photographs. So it doesn't look as though it was him. The other teacher, she's still alive, but she's very unwell, unfortunately. And Rosie Jones was able to have a chat with her several years ago. And because of her illness, even though she was able to confirm that she was at Westall as a teacher, and she remembered something about a kerfuffle involving flying saucers, she didn't have any more memories than that. So she and her son, who were able to be in contact with, simply weren't able to confirm that aspect of the story. But the witnesses who remember it, they remember that a teacher took photographs using the school's camera. There was only one camera back in those days. The school had a single camera. It was the school camera. Nobody else had cameras. And of course, kids didn't have access to cameras in those days. And she took photos, or someone took photos. And when the Royal Australian Air Force officers came to the school, which they did, they came to the school apparently that day, some say the following day, and some witnesses have memories of the camera and the film inside, the whole thing being handed over to these Air Force officers. And of course, the film, the camera perhaps, never seen again.
Wow, wow. And what about the, more or less, the silencing of everyone? Was there, I don't want to say threats, but were there sort of like stern, well, maybe threats is the right word, not to talk about this?
That's right. Some people talk about that. A lot of the witnesses talk about there being this assembly that afternoon, an assembly organised by the headmaster, Mr. Sambleby, and it was held in the quadrangle that afternoon, and everybody was told that they hadn't seen flying saucers. There are no such things as flying saucers, and they weren't to talk about it. And they certainly weren't to talk to the media, because the media had started gathering out the front of the school. And several students had in fact already started giving TV interviews. And those interviews were very quickly, abruptly interrupted. One of the students, Joy, very clearly remembers, she remembers it in a very tactile way, talking to the Channel 9 interviewer, the camera operator there, and this man in a blue uniform she'd never seen before. She remembers him as being a police officer or perhaps an Air Force officer because of the blue uniform, coming up, putting his hand on her shoulder and saying, "This interview is over. You're not to talk about this. Get back into school." He then turns around, talks, and to the media people says, "Get out of here. This interview is over." And that was it. She goes back into school. She gets given detention, as one or two of the other students were also given detention who had tried to speak to the media. One of the students gave an interview with the local newspaper, the Dandenong Journal. The Dandenong Journal newspaper was the one that broke the story at the time. And so it was front page news for a couple of weeks running in this local newspaper. And thank goodness this newspaper still exists today and we have access to their archives. She gave an interview, as did Andrew Greenwood, with the newspaper. And she got detention as a student. And Andrew Greenwood was definitely wrapped over the knuckles by his headmaster. And for Andrew Greenwood, that was a bit upsetting as a new student, a teacher rather, a relatively young teacher. But more upsetting for him was when about 3 days later he had the knock on the door at home. He answered the door. This was after he'd come home from work. And there were two people, one in an Air Force officer's uniform, one in civilian clothes. And they wanted to talk to him. And he thought, well, that's interesting. They're wanting to talk to me about the UFO, to take down details of what I'd seen. And his mother was home at the time and she sat in a separate room and he sat down with the two government people. They weren't interested in what he'd seen. They didn't want to know any details. And in fact, they said to him, "We want you to be quiet about this. There are no such things as flying saucers. And we don't want you saying that you saw one." And he remembers saying to the Air Force officers, "Well, hang on a minute. If there are no such things as flying saucers, why does it matter if I say that I saw a flying saucer? Why is it of any interest to you?
Mm-hmm.
And why are you at my house?" And the tone turned rather negative after that, apparently. And they said to him, "Mr. Greenwood, if you talk again about this, like you have done with the local newspaper, we'll make sure you don't teach in this state again. We'll tell the newspapers that you're not coping as a new teacher, that you're taking alcohol in the morning with your breakfast cereal, and you'll never teach again."
Unreal. Unbelievable. Were there more threats like that or similar to that? I mean, you said there was the assembly, and at that point they were told not to talk about it. But I mean, how can you stop kids from talking about it, to their parents and things like that? I mean, that's just going to happen. I mean, they can't really stop. They must have known they couldn't stop that.
I think that's true. I think if you put yourselves into the shoes of the school principal, the administrators, it was a reasonable thing in a way what they did, because they were trying to obviously not just protect the reputation of the school, but they were very much, I think, trying to protect the reputation, the well-being of the students, because they could see, I think, that this could very easily get out of hand, that there'd be more media, that the school could get overrun with onlookers, sightseers. And this was the second last day of the school term. The next day, very conveniently for the school and for the story going underground, was the last day of school term. It was the last day before the Easter school holidays. And so there was a 2-week break then. And so the school really only had to survive another 24 hours or so before everybody went away for at least 2 weeks. And the story did die down, and people did move on with their lives. But there were a whole lot of people, of course, who never forgot what they had seen. But yes, there were some other people who were called into the headmaster's office, and one of those students, Jacqueline, talks about the memory of being grilled by these 2 people in dark suits with short cropped hair. Well, nearly everybody had short cropped hair in those days, but short cropped hair, looking very serious, as if they were from the government. And they were grilling her about, they were saying, do you really want us to believe that you saw little green men? Do you really want us to believe that you saw aliens? And she was saying, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying I saw this object. I'm not saying I saw this, or I saw this object. I saw it close. It had this effect on my school friends. It was oval shaped. It made no noise. It flew like I've never seen any other object fly. And she got so upset, not just with their questions and the pressure they were putting on her as a 14-year-old girl, but she was upset with her headmaster, who was in the office with her, with them, and him not coming to her aid.
I see.
Him not defending her. And so she ran out of the office crying, and she ran home. Her home wasn't very far away. She ran home, bawling her eyes out because of this experience that she'd had with these men.
Wow, that's amazing. So you've mentioned that you still basically, are you still working this case? I mean, are you still, like, even now talking to witnesses?
So I'm still working this case, Martin. Somebody's got to do the dirty work, and that's me at the moment, and has been for the last 14 years. And some other researchers have looked at the case, of course, long before I came along. And there are other people still interested in it, obviously. But I'm very actively working the case. We've had some very interesting leads relatively recently, for example, and the leads are both promising and incredibly excruciatingly frustrating, as is often the case with UFO story leads. A gentleman has come forward, the grandson of a man who he says was at Westall that day, working for a federal government department called the Department of Supply. And this man also had the job to be the personal protection officer and driver for the then Prime Minister of Australia. And whenever the Prime Minister of Australia was in Melbourne, so not here in Canberra but in Melbourne, he would be the driver and security man for this Prime Minister. His name was Harold Holt. And this man has come forward saying that his grandfather told him out of the blue one day about the Westall UFO case and how he was there and how it was about time the truth came out about it, for the sake of everybody, for all of the witnesses, that the truth be known about what happened at Westall. And this man talked to his mother and 2 aunts, the daughters of this grandfather, and they refused to talk to him about what happened, about what they heard from their father, what he saw that day at Westall, what his involvement was. All they have been prepared to say to him is that he was never the same again. His demeanour changed after Westall.
Wow.
And so, unfortunately, the man, the grandfather, has long since passed away. But the man was given some diaries by his grandfather. And in his diaries, he remembers reading an account of going out to Westall, who was there, what he saw. And unfortunately, of course, in true UFO story style, those diaries have now gone missing. And they haven't yet been found. But hopefully, this man going through his grandfather's papers and other information and hopefully talking again with his mother and his aunts will be able to give us some more information about what his grandfather's involvement was. Another witness, in a way, has come forward recently, posting on Facebook, saying that he knows the pilots that were in the aeroplanes that day, that they came from Moorabbin Airport, the nearby airport, and he knows one of the pilots in particular who gave chase to the flying saucer and tried to follow it, but couldn't because it flew so fast it just left him behind. But he tried to follow it, and that this pilot is still alive. Of course, he's elderly, he's living in a nursing home, he's unwell, he lives in far north Queensland, a long way from where I am. But this man, so far, even after many efforts I've made, isn't prepared to divulge the name or the location of this pilot.
Wow, that would be really amazing. And as you have gone along, have you? Well, by the way, I'm putting the lines open here now if anyone wants to call in, because I do want to change topics coming up, but I do want to give the listening audience an opportunity to talk about this case. So that number is 855-472-5483, and that's up on the screen in YouTube. And I forgot where I was going, and I started out with one question and shifted gears into the phone call.
Well, that's okay, Martin. If I could just mention very quickly,
sure.
If anybody wants a lovely pressy, a summary of the Westall story, several years ago, the wonderful British researcher Philip Mantell was the editor of a rather short-lived series of UFO magazines called UFO Matrix, and it became a terrible headache and trauma for Philip, unfortunately. But the several issues of the magazine that came out were very, very good, had wonderful production values, and in one of them, this one here, UFO Matrix, is the first part of an article about the UFO, the Westall UFO Incident, and it continued in the next edition. And you can see there's some wonderful artwork here, not necessarily to be related to the Westall Incident specifically, but if you can get your hands on those magazines, UFO Matrix, they came out of the United Kingdom, but they were very widely available several years ago. That's a good place to go to. Also, the city of Kingston, which is the local government area that incorporates Westall, the Kingston City Council, on its historical website pages, it also has an article penned by me about the Westall story. And so that's also a very good summation of what happened way back then.
Interesting. This is probably a little bit of an odd question, but it seems to me when there's an encounter like this, some of the people that go through an encounter change. I think you mentioned that about the police officer, but there's maybe some type of change that they've noticed. Has anyone talked about anything like that, or any type of message they thought they were getting? That's another thing you often hear about, and I know it's no one saw any type of being or anything, but I'm just wondering if any claims along those lines were ever made.
You had to mention the B word, didn't you? You had to talk about beings. I was really trying to stay away from that, Martin. I'm happy to stay with human beings, but that's a bit of a challenge a lot of the time. But look, I'll be honest with you, and there's not much in relation to witness accounts talking about beings, but there are some.
There are.
And there are a couple of witnesses who have talked about seeing beings associated with the flying saucer at Westall. Only a couple, and they talk about the beings as being very human-like, coming out of the craft, wearing close-fitting uniforms, a little bit like astronaut uniforms, but not astronaut uniforms, and then seeing the being, the person, going back into the craft. So it's not a prominent part of the story, but I'll admit to you that it's there. And of course, my job as the researcher is to receive the stories, accept them, try to put them into a context, and to keep an open mind. But in terms of people being affected, you know what? With all of this terrible stuff happening at the moment in relation to climate change, and here in Australia, we're currently experiencing what many people believe is the worst drought since the European settlement of Australia in 1788.
Wow,
Terrible
I didn't know that. A drought. Wow.
It's the worst drought in human memory, in human records, since European settlement at least. Lack of rainfall, high temperatures, the terrible bushfires that are happening. And it makes me think about that other wonderful school-based incident which happened in 1994 over in Zimbabwe and in Rua. And the message that those kids got from the beings, from the people that they saw and received some sort of communication from. That really hasn't happened in the Westall story. But I think some witnesses have talked to me about how what happened at Westall, opening their minds to perhaps a larger reality or a different reality, a change in perspective, a greater openness, and certainly perhaps a little bit of suspicion around how governments work, how bureaucracies work, how secrets can actually be kept from people, and being a little bit more sensitive to that.
How about that? That's really interesting. Again, I just want to say the lines are open, 855-472-5483. Sometimes we get several calls, sometimes no one calls in, so we never know what's going to happen. Now, about James Fox, he was there. There's a segment in Phenomena in his film coming out. We have a phone call coming in now. I'll take that in a minute. But you got to meet with James. He's a great guy, isn't he?
He is. He's a wonderful fellow, full of energy,
yes,
full of excitement, full
sure
of passion.
Is.
And I met his lovely wife, Rebecca, and their beautiful son, Ollie, as well. So he came out 2 years ago, and we spent the best part of a week together in Melbourne. And we filmed at Westall, both at the primary school, which we haven't talked a lot about. There were a lot of witnesses at the primary school. Oh. And James and I actually addressed a gathering of the kids at the primary school and met one of the primary school witnesses who's now on staff at the primary school. And we filmed at the high school as well, down at the Grange. We had quite a few of the Westall witnesses there. And we actually did some filming with some other people associated with the Westall story, and people who had not really ever been filmed before, had not really spoken in public before. And I'm remaining hopeful. I don't know, of course, this is up to James and his team, but I'm remaining hopeful that at least part of that will be indeed featured in his upcoming film, The Phenomenon.
Yeah, I can't wait for that to come out. Okay, so we have a call. We have Dale. Dale is calling from Arizona. Welcome to the show, Dale.
Hey, it's great to be here.
Thank you.
Love being a part.
All right, great. You have a question for our guest tonight?
Actually, I was just calling in and talking to Race, just kind of rekindle a friendship. I apologize. It's kind of probably a glitch on the system, but what's the discussion tonight? I probably have some great insight.
Okay. And I'm sorry, did you have a question for our guest?
I'm sorry, I don't, because I haven't been paying attention.
Okay. All
I
right.
I was just calling in for Race.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for the call. You can call him back at another time. All right. So we have another caller coming aboard here in a minute. They're just hopefully he's going to be screening that a little better. And sorry about that, everyone. And so Mike will be on the line here in just a second. He's calling from Cincinnati. I think that's where he's calling from. Mike, welcome to the show.
Yes, sir. Oh, hi, Martin.
Hi there.
I wanted to ask him if he's talked to, I believe he said 117 witnesses. How many folks in all is estimated witnessed this that day? Is one of my questions.
Sure. Thank you. That was a very good question. So, yes, I have been in contact with 117 people who were witnesses to the flying saucer or flying saucers, 165 who saw the circles, the ground marks left behind. And of that, there's a subset of about 70 people who saw both the flying saucer and the circles. In terms of the total number, Andrew Greenwood, the science teacher at Westall High School at the time, he's on the record as saying about 3/4 of the school population was out on the sports ground witnessing the event as it unfolded. And there were about 585 kids at the school at the time and about 25 staff. So something like 600 people in total, and 3/4 of that, roundabout, were witnesses at the high school. And so I've always said to people, you can quite safely say it was something, it was certainly in the hundreds. It was 200, 300, 400 people. One can't be, of course, absolute about this, but it was that sort of number. And so pretty significant. And remembering broad daylight in the suburbs of Australia's second largest city, so significant.
Very significant. Another thing, when you held up the newspaper that did publish the story and you turned it around to the back side, I believe it was another story you were trying to point out, I saw the headline said, "Who were the 5 pilots?" Was that related?
So that's this one here. So this is the second article that appeared in this newspaper. Is related, yes. So who were 5 pilots? That's the newspaper asking the story, who were the 5 pilots that were seen, who were piloting the planes that were seen flying around the flying saucer at the time. So 5 planes, 5 pilots. Who were they? Efforts were made at the time to work out where the planes had come from, who the pilots were. That all drew blanks. No one could work out who they were. One of the teachers at the high school at the time made a phone call within 30 minutes of the incident happening to the airport, the local airport, and they were given short shrift, given no information at all.
One final question. The 2 girls that were affected by being close to the UFO, was that an effect of the thing taken off? Do you know? Were they knocked back or fainted because it was leaving at that point?
So that's something that's not known. I don't know. Obviously, the timing is a little bit hard to ascertain. When one of the witnesses arrived on the scene, the object was apparently stationary just above the ground, and one of the girls was still on the ground. One was recovering, and then a few seconds after that, it seems, the object began to ascend and then tilted into the vertical plane and took off. So it sounds like it happened before it was lifting off, but I'll be honest with you, it's hard, of course, to be, again, completely absolute about that.
Well, thank you very much for taking my call.
Pleasure. Thank you.
You're very welcome. All right, Mike. So we have another call coming in, and I think we're all set to take Andy from Connecticut. Welcome back, Andy.
Hi. Thanks for taking my call, guys. Great show, as always. I just wanted to ask real quick if your guest was able to get a sense from all of the people he's interviewed, how many feel as though they were definitely intimidated by the military or police at the school, and if they feel that any U.S. Military people were involved. How clear is their memory of that event?
Oh,
and I'll take your answer off there.
All right, Andy. Thank you
very much.
Thanks, guys.
Yes, let's make it more international. Let's get the Americans involved, because that's always trouble, isn't it? But I'm sorry, I'm joking. In terms of intimidation, the majority of the sense of intimidation or threat really, I guess, was mediated through the school authority. So it came via the headmaster or the deputy headmaster or one or two of the executive teachers. So it was really coming through the school, and you can understand why that may have been. As I mentioned before, they were trying to keep a lid on things, trying to protect the safety, the welfare of the students, as well as the staff and the school. But there are witnesses, a lot of witnesses, who talk about at the assembly there being an extra presence. It wasn't just the headmaster and the staff. There were people there in uniform. There were people there in suits. People remember it differently. Some people remember both. And these were people who had never been at the school before. Some people talk about there being military people walking the corridors of the school. And the message was given at that assembly, either directly from these government people or through the headmaster, that they were to keep quiet about this, that it was nothing to do with flying saucers, that it was perhaps some secret government program and it wasn't to be discussed, it was something experimental, and they were to keep quiet. So a lot of witnesses talk about that. Again, another aspect of the story is what happened when the kids went home. And it was a varied experience. For some of the students, when they went home, the story was received with open hands. Their parents wanted to know. They wanted to hear all about it. For other kids, it was a different experience. Their parents wanted nothing to do with this story, or they were simply uninterested. They didn't want to hear about it at all. And discussion within the family around the dinner table just didn't happen. And that seems to have been the experience for most of the witnesses, that at the time or afterwards, their story was met with ridicule or disinterest. And in a way, you can understand it, because I think we all have the experience, any of us who have children, our kids often come home or they come into the room and they're talking about something they've seen or something that's happened. And almost our initial reaction, I think, as an adult is to be skeptical, to be disbelieving, because they're kids. It's sort of a natural reaction. So in a way, it's understandable. But in relation to an incident like this, a story like this, it's very, very unfortunate.
Right. I want to move on to other Australian cases. But I will say that we'll still take calls if someone wants to talk about this case. And that number again is 855-472-5483. And so what are, would you consider this the top UFO incident in Australia, or does something else trump that?
It's hard to grade these things, of course, but in terms of it being a mass witness sighting, it's certainly the biggest mass witness daylight sighting of at least one, probably more UFOs. And so it's right up there, Martin. And I think in terms of at the international level, it's right up there in terms of a mass witness daylight sighting, and also taking into account the response to it by the government authorities. And when this story became better known through Rosie Jones' documentary Westall 66 and the other media that's covered the story over the years, every time there's something on TV or in a newspaper or in a magazine, I get contacted by new witnesses to this incident quite often, and sometimes witnesses to similar incidents. And so over the years, I've gathered this small collection of other school-based sightings that have happened in Australia. And one of them happened only about 20 kilometres away, 2 years later, in another Melbourne school, another high school. And there was a small article about it. A journalist from The Age newspaper went to the school to talk to the kids about becoming a journalist, about journalism. And he got to the school gate, and all the kids wanted to talk about was the UFO that they'd just seen, hovering above the school, flying over the school. And so that's what he ended up writing about the next day in the newspaper. And then that story was gone. It was lost. Nobody else ever talked about it. It was never reported again. I stumbled across it going through the newspaper archives, made contact with some of those people who were there that day through Facebook, through email, was able to gather information about that story. And so there are some other similar stories like that. Not many, I don't think, but I'm cautious when I say that now. Ever since Preston Dennett came along with that wonderful book that he's just published about school-based UFO sightings, and he blew my socks off with how many that he had discovered.
I can't believe it. I know it was 100 something.
Wonderful. Yeah. And some of them I did know about, but most of them I did not. And I think he's done a terrific job unearthing the number that he has done. And there are probably more out there that he hasn't found, but he's done a wonderful job. And so it's really this important subset, I think, within the UFO phenomena of sightings. And like Preston asks out loud, as he did on your program a few weeks ago, what does it mean? Why do UFOs appear above schools? Why is there this interaction between the kids and the UFOs? What are we supposed to take from that? And of course, it's an open question, but it's a fascinating one. And for me, my eyes were really opened when, again, I made a trip to Sydney to talk to the UFO Research New South Wales organisation at one of their meetings several years ago. And one of their members walked up to me and said, Shane, do you know about the UFO sighting that happened at the school called Crestview Elementary School in Opa-Locka in Florida, in the suburbs of Miami in 1967? And I said, no, I know nothing about that. I'd gone to the meeting to address the members about the Westall story. And he showed me this book, this wonderful book you probably know about, Martin, written by the Lorenzens back in the 1960s, called UFOs Over the Americas. And there's a whole section in the book which details the Crestview Elementary School incident, which happened exactly a year to the day, the 6th of April, 1967, a year to the day after Westall. And there are so many elements of the story. And it was an incident which happened over 3 days. And not many people know that Westall also was an incident which involved several days.
I didn't know that.
Sightings.
Wow.
There were sightings, yes, by several witnesses in the day and the following days, up to the following weekend, of the same shaped object over Westall by the same kids. And the same thing happened at Crestview in the suburbs of Miami. And so many other elements, the Air Force going to Crestview, the police, the flying saucers descending and ascending behind pine trees on the other side of the road from where the school was, ground marks being found in the field near the school, circles of discoloured grass, kids being told not to talk about it, the science teacher at the elementary school being one of the protagonists at the Crestview sighting, just like at Westall. It's almost as if our minds are being played with in some way, that someone somewhere has this wonderful sense of humour. And of course, as human beings, we like to see patterns in things. We like to put the pieces together and discover patterns where perhaps patterns don't really exist. But when you see coincidences like this involving dates and ages of kids and people, and it's hard not to get a little bit curious about it all.
Yeah, and especially if they would follow our calendar. Who knows what their calendar would be to be 1 year. We have Ron. Ron is calling from Minnesota. Hi, Ron. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Martin. Glad to be here and glad to have a live show tonight. Thank you. And hello, Shane.
Hello.
And I had a question for Shane, and maybe for Martin too. Both of you can answer it. Out of all of your investigations of this subject or topic, have you ever seen one in real life? And what do you think, or who do you think they are?
Oh, Martin, you should definitely go first with that one.
Okay, well, just to let you know, we only have about 4 minutes left, so we have we're in a tight. Well, yeah, I had a sighting. I actually have talked about it a number of times. I hate to be redundant, so but it was I consider it kind of a boring sighting, but it was a flying saucer. I mean, as close as you can say to what I saw was a perfect disc in California several years ago. And it was, I tried to report it, and I didn't know who to report it to and all that stuff. It wasn't anything fantastical, but it's still the thing that baffled me the most was the no sound part of it. I couldn't understand that when it was moving and all that. But Shane, go ahead. Did you ever have any type of sighting?
In a sense, I did. A few years ago, I traveled to a country town about 2 hours from where I live here in Canberra, where my grandparents had been married. And I was going to visit the church where they were married to have a look. And as I was driving, as I was getting closer to the town, I saw this series of round white light discs. They were sort of a bit fluffy, high up in the sky, in a formation, racing across the sky. And as I was traveling along the road in my car, trying to keep looking at them as I'm driving and looking out the window and out at the windscreen, and I stopped the car at a town just before the town I was going to, and stopped the car at this rest spot where there were people serving coffee, and I got out and I could still see them in the sky flying over. And I talked to the people who were there, and they hadn't noticed them, and they didn't seem to be paying much attention to them even after I had pointed it out to them. You know how these mysterious things sometimes happen with UFO encounters? So they were UFOs because they were flying and I couldn't identify them, never seen anything like it before, but who knows what they were.
Yeah, I have the same
Thank
thought.
you.
I have no idea what they were. But
Thank
thanks
you,
for the
Martin,
call, Ron.
and thank you, Shane.
All right. Have
Thank
a good
you,
night.
Grace. Bye.
Bye. All right. Yeah, that's going to be it for calls for us tonight. We only have a few minutes left. So I think with that few minutes, the interesting part I think about this is the aftermath, and that still after 50 years, people come forward and talk about it. And I was just also wondering, were there any other type of, like a farmer or anything like that, that said they saw this thing as well, this incident, besides school children and teachers?
There were, so excuse me, Martin, there were a lot of there were residents in the Westall area who were also witnesses, and one of them had been a student at Westall High School a couple of years earlier and was working as a farmhand. He was only 16 years old at the time, but he was working as a farmhand in the market garden adjacent to the Grange with his boss, who was a man in his late 20s, I think, at that point, and another man in his early 20s. And they witnessed the flying saucer coming down towards the pine trees at the Grange. And Paul, who was the witness, says it didn't look in the same way as the kids have described it over the years. For him, it looked as though it was something being projected into the sky. And it was solid to begin with. And then as it traveled down towards the Grange, towards the pine trees, it began to change and became gradually more translucent, and then eventually almost transparent, with these colours, blues and purples and greens in the mix.
Wow.
And it flew into the grove of pine trees. And the pine trees didn't move. And the flying saucer, the object, didn't come out the other side. It just vanished. And something just like this happened at Crestview a year later. And all three of these boys and men saw this. And then they saw the kids from Westall High School coming rushing down, chasing whatever it was that they had seen, the same object, presumably. Wow. And then 20 minutes later, 2 army trucks and 2 Land Rovers full of about 20 soldiers turned up in the neighbouring paddock with trucks full of equipment and started looking for what they had seen and started investigating.
Wow.
And so there were other witnesses. It wasn't just the school kids and the teachers at the schools.
Well, we are totally out of time. Thanks so much. It was fun, as always, talking to you. I really appreciate it. And you take care.
Thank you, Martin. Take care of yourself. Thank you.
All right. All right, everyone. So that is it for the show this evening. And as I mentioned, if you are listening to this show on YouTube, you want to click that bell next to the subscription subscribe button there to get a notification, because I don't know exactly when I'm going to have the next show and who's going to be on. Remember to check out our T-shirts over at Podcast UFO, the blog over there as well. And I want to thank everyone that helps out. And remember to keep your eyes to the sky.